Well, hello everybody. We're going to wait just a couple of minutes, and I believe we have a few of us joining. We're just going to wait just a minute. But while we're waiting, let me just say thank you for those who were back in touch over this past week. In particular, got a really helpful email from someone who asked for some clarification on some points I was trying to make last week, as well as my apologies. It was just sort of a huge information dump. I have put my notes together from last week and I've sent them to Ashley Cameron. And if you want to receive a copy, that may be the best way. You can just email info@stmarysgoochland.org, and we'll be glad just to send those notes to you. That might be helpful. Hopefully this is not as big as just sort of information dump this week. I want to sort of take some of the theory that we talked a little bit about last week and begin to do something with it. So what I want to do today is look at those 5 hallmarks that I suggested for a full moral consideration. And then I'd like to sort of bring those ideas into contact with the 3 questions I left you with. The question about finding a bag of money beside the road and parking in a handicapped spot, and also coming across a disabled motorist, and what do you do? And then I want to take a look at a pattern for moral reflection that I've adopted from an ethics class and put in front of you, and conclude with pointing towards next week when we move from moral consideration into a more specifically Christian moral consideration. Okay, so the 5 hallmarks or points of reference for a full moral consideration that I've suggested are that the moral life is concerned with what is right and what is wrong, and understanding that decision to be finding the fitting response, right and wrong, and finding a fitting response. And we're particularly interested in difficult questions, even questions that you would consider a moral dilemma, which is to say, if I choose this way, there's a negative remainder. And if I choose that way, there is a negative remainder. In other words, whichever way you choose, there's going to be an unaddressed part of your decision. And so in these instances, making a moral decision means making a decision that we can live with. Augustine, who sort of famously put together the just war theory, and that Aquinas later built on, I think what Augustine was most interested in when nations or states are considering waging war is not so much, running it through this moral calculator and going, bing, it's a just war. What he was interested in is helping a society count the cost of waging war with eyes wide open, or declining to wage war with eyes wide open. In Aristotle's extraordinary Nicomachean Ethics, he reminded us to to have a kind of humility about difficult decisions. He said that if a question before you is complicated and fraught with complexity, don't expect the answer to be any different than one that is complicated and fraught with complexity. If we have a complicated question, we're not going to have a simple answer. So this first hallmark of moral consideration is this question of answering what is right and what is wrong, and particularly when it is complicated. All right, the second hallmark is the moral life is always experienced as intersubjective, which is a horrible word, but I haven't come up with a better one yet, which means that we are obliged to take into account that we live as persons among persons, that we are never solitary and isolated. In fact, who we are, in large part, is determined by our relationship to other, and community's relationship to other communities. I think I suggested that John Donne's famous poem could be of help when he said, no man is entire unto himself. One of the beautiful insights from the creation story is that Adama, the earthling, Adam, did not know who he was until he beheld himself with another human, Eve. Then he knew who he was. So the moral consideration is always intersubjective. It always takes into account that we know who we are in light of others. I think this is a particularly challenging area for us. One of the hallmarks of modernity, the modern world, which really emerged full bore in the late 18th century, is the elevation of the priority of the individual. And the gift of that is to see each human creature as of infinite value, as bearing the image of God. Very different than the classical world, where you understood yourself as a part of the whole. The modern world elevates the priority of the individual. The downside of that is a loss of community and isolation and an increasing fragmentation of shared values, which I think we're experiencing now. So this intersubjective life is challenging for us. The third hallmark is that in the moral life, we are entering into a living drama, which is to say, I used to be an actor, and I remember a part where I came in the second act, and I just walked into this world that was already going on, that already had established conventions, that there were stories and histories that had already happened, and I just sort of moved into that. And so that is for all of us. We are not born into a kind of vacuum. We are born into histories of people, and we bear those histories in our own personal histories, which is challenging as well. Am I, as a person, as a member of a community, am I culpable for past transgressions? Perhaps not personally, but neither are we not a part of those histories. Okay, fourth, it is for a full moral consideration. How we arrive at a decision is important. It's one thing to go, oh, well, I feel this way about it. It's difficult to make a defense for your position or your choice just from that. The ethical world applies a kind of discipline to the way we're thinking. And a simple way of thinking this, I think, is to be able to make a defense of where you end up. Here is why I've made the choice that I've made. Here are the values and principles upon which that's based. Here is how I think about it, and here's how I've arrived at it. One of the things that I appreciated so much in ethics class in seminary was our ethics professor thundering at us that we ought to at least do a person who holds a different point of view. We should at least do them the courtesy of understanding their argument, rather than just, you're wrong, understanding how they've arrived at their decision. So, moral consideration requires some discipline. And finally, the fifth, what is necessary for a full moral consideration is imagination, believe it or not. And what that means in this instance is to have the capacity to imagine what life is like for this person or these persons. Also, to be able to imagine or think through the consequences of a choice. A moral imagination for what life is like for others, like your children or members of your parish, and also consequences of a choice you may make. Just getting ready to ask, are there any questions? If there are, you can certainly just chat them in. All right, I left you with three, in some ways, simple questions, just to sort of get a feel for what's involved when you make a moral choice. And the first one was, you find a brown paper bag beside the road, and you're curious, so you pick it up, and you look inside, and there's a bunch of cash money in there. And the question is, what do you do? What you do is a function of who you understand yourself to be. All moral consideration begins with this deep sense of identity. For example, both of my parents reminded us that a part of who we were as their children, as responsible citizens, as children of God, were people who would tell the truth. You must tell the truth. You have to be honest. And that was a categorical imperative. So that shaped us as people who tell the truth, who are truthful. Otherwise, there'll be consequences. So the way that I find myself processing that is from that sense that dishonesty, like stealing, is not permissible. To open up the question a little bit more is to consider, why would you return it? So for me, it would be a question of identity. I asked somebody if they would keep it, and we decided that, it wouldn't be any fun to keep it because you'd feel wrapped with guilt. Well, that's because you've transgressed your own sense of who you are as a person. You can also imagine the answers to the questions, why would I keep it? And I think about entertaining what a person who decided to keep it might say. What are those persons' compelling obligations that would lead them to find it morally acceptable to keep that money? These are really just these questions are exercises for your own kind of, for taking a sounding. Do you know what a sounding is? I learned what this was living on the Northern Neck. It's a nautical term. A sounding is where you've got a rope that's got either knots every however many feet or colored tape, and you lower it over the side of the boat to see how deep it'll go. So taking a sounding of your own soul is to sort of fathom, your own structures. So these questions are largely for you to explore your own sense of how you make moral decisions. Okay, this one's a little more complicated. So a member of your family is really sick, and you've got a prescription, and you've gotten them home and squared away, and you've got to run out to get that prescription filled so that you can, let's just say, get antibiotics in them as soon as possible. And you come up to the drugstore, and it's quite dark, and you see some young people, sort of in front of the drugstore, just hanging out or something. And the one place that is well lighted is a handicapped parking spot right there by the entrance to the store. You're harried and scared and harassed. And the question is it permissible to park in that place? Again, what's important is the way you process this in your own spirit. And in some ways, it's not necessarily important about the choice you make, but how do you process it? How do you arrive at a decision that either says yes or no? How is it in accord with your own identity? How is it in accord or not with your obligation to others? The reality is this is designated for people who may have physical disabilities and who benefit from use of a parking place in near proximity to the opening, and maybe a handicap ramp. Are we not obliged to those people even in those circumstances? If in fact the moral life is an intersubjective life, what does your own moral imagination tell you about the needs of that person who may arrive at any moment? Or does your own compelling sense that you are perhaps afraid, that you need to move quickly, and that you're concerned for this person at home trumps other obligations? What would you do?
Well, isn't part of the moral imagination in the situation also how you perceive the others that are hanging out in front of the gas station?
Precisely. Thank you. See, and this is what's so good about having other people to have a conversation. If you didn't hear, Ashley said, what about the people who are hanging out here, hanging out in front of the store? And I loaded it up to say young people, kind of in the dark, right? That's on purpose. Ashley wondered about your own obligation to those people. What's your reflection, Ashley, on that?
Well, it's
It's kind of a moral imagination of like, are you perceiving them to be dangerous or not?
Right.
You know?
Right. Are you perceiving them to be a threat to you or dangerous in some way? And if so, why? Obviously, these are sort of loaded little questions, but we live in the midst of loaded little questions. Part of what I hope this helps one sense is that moral decision making, the how of it, and being rigorous about it matters if we are only driven by our affections, fear, whatever. It's incomplete. It may be understandable, but it's an incomplete moral reflection. Okay. The concluding question was that you're driving home on 64 West, and it's after dinner or something like that. And as we often do, you'll see a car up ahead. You see the flashers, and they pulled off to the side of the road. They have a flat tire or engine trouble or something. And then on the grassy place beside the car is the driver, and you would guess that these two children are this person's children. The question is, do you count on someone else to stop, or do you stop? And what leads you? How do you make that choice? What is it that contributes to you going, here's what I will do? And are those reasons in accord with who you are and how you understand your own obligations to yourself for who you are, which is quite powerful. I am this kind of person, as well as one's obligation to others. And then I sort of loaded this question up by wondering, does it make any difference what race these people are? White people, black people. And I also wondered, does it make a difference what age the adult is? I think all of those things are part of how one would consider what one is going to do. And says a lot about our own sort of internal structures, moral imagination, sense of identity. What was the other one I was thinking of? Again, I'm not so much interested in finding the right answer. What is important is that we be able to make a defense that is moral for our choices. There's a particular context in our culture these days, and this may be a semi-rant, so stay with me for a second. I think for a variety of reasons, that broadly speaking, we have found ourselves to be a deeply fragmented people, nation. One of the contributing factors to that, I would say, is that people get their information about things from certain news sources, that you plug into, which is fine, that are ideologically driven. And there's nothing wrong with ideology as long as it's supported by, critical thinking. My beef is the problem with the way ideology is employed in our culture is we've gotten lazy, that we have we have agreed to let somebody else do our thinking for us. And then, we watch it and they'll tell us how we're supposed to feel about something, which to me is just infuriating. What I'm interested in is us as people and communities doing our own thinking for ourselves. As you know, this world is tragic and glorious. It is a mixed bag, and so are we. And we don't often fit neatly into, here's what this means, here's what this means. We are aware of the complexity of the world that we're living in, as well as the complexity that's right in here. Okay, I'm moving towards the end. I want to show you, let's see, I hope this will work. And I think I introduced this at an adult forum, I don't even know what year it is, a couple of years ago. And in terms of doing our own thinking for ourselves, taking into account a full moral consideration that leads us to make a choice and to act, I just want to suggest this. First, as I said last week, that moral consideration begins with the affections. It means something to us. We see something and it may offend our sense of what it means to be a human being in this world. What then follows is something like those 5 hallmarks that I've described to you, which is to be thoughtful and critical, which is to say critical, which means to think with some precision, with some discipline, what's going on, a full and critical examination of who, what, when, where, why, all those things. Move from, for example, a sense of outrage into answering questions together that are really getting at what's going on. And then from there, you move to action and decision. As a result of this moment, therefore I shall do this. I think there's a lot of going from this to this without much thoughtful engagement with the issues that are that emerge from that sense of outrage or that deep place where we discover that something matters to us and matters very much. Let me give you one little example. So I'm calling this confessional grounding, which is to say, I am, we are. Here is who I am. What resides at that deep level. And an example is when Jesus says to us, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your mind and with all your soul. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself. That's the kind of person, creature of God is. That's the identity we bear. And you'll remember in the story where Jesus was responding to a young man, or in another instance, a lawyer, the lawyer then said, who is my neighbor? That's what's going on right there. Jesus says, love God, love yourself, and love your neighbor. The lawyer then goes, who's my neighbor? Well, this is the critique. This is the meditative, thoughtful moment. And then Jesus says, I got a story for you. And of course, it's the story of the Good Samaritan. And that's what leads to action. All right, picking up on that, next week, I've entitled this little series, The Christian Moral Life. What do the claims of our identity that are made by life in Christ, what Paul called in Christu, in Christ, that I am obliged to take into account because I believe that I am bound to Christ. Because of who Jesus is and who Jesus is for me and for us and for the world, how shall I live and the exigencies and vicissitudes of this fallen and glorious world to bear forward the cause of Christ and his kingdom. So we're going to move from a general sort of examination of what comprises ample consideration of the moral life to what makes our considerations particularly Christian moral life. And that has everything to do with the life of Jesus of Nazareth. I hope that if you have thoughts, concerns, your own rants, whatever you'd like to offer, you'll feel free to email at info@stmarysgoochland.org. God bless you all.